The air inside the small cabin was a constant 68 degrees. Outside, in the screaming chaos of the third day of the great blizzard of 1878, the temperature in the Montana Territory had plunged to 42 below zero, a number that had lost all meaning. It was a cold that didn't just bite, it consumed. It was a cold that shattered trees, froze cattle solid in the fields, and found its way through the tiniest chink in a log wall with the malevolent intelligence of a predator, but inside the air was still and warm and breathable. Elsbeth Schmidt, all of 12 years old, placed a single seasoned log of lodgepole pine into the firebox of the enormous masonry stove that dominated the eastern wall of her dwelling. She did not slam the heavy iron door shut. She closed it with a quiet, metallic click that spoke of precision and care. The stove itself, a towering structure of river stone and clay plaster that reached nearly to the ceiling, made no sound. It did not roar or crackle. It simply radiated a profound, bone-deep warmth into the 16 by 20-foot space. Her father's old wolfhound Kaiser sighed in his sleep, his paws twitching as he dreamed of summer rabbits. On the small table, a single candle flame stood perfectly erect, its light reflecting in the small, deep-set window pane, a pane that showed no frost, not even at the edges. Beyond that glass, the world was a vortex of white fury. She could see the faint, desperate glimmer of a lantern bobbing and weaving across the flat 100 yards distant near the Croft homestead. It appeared, vanished, then appeared again, a frantic star fighting a losing battle against the storm. It was a light of panic. She knew it, just as she knew the sound of freezing wood, the taste of fear in the air, and the specific quality of warmth that meant survival. The men who had built the valley's cabins, strong men with decades of experience, were fighting for their lives in structures that were now becoming their tombs. And here, in the shelter they had called a child's folly, a girl's burrow, a grave dug by grief, a 12-year-old girl was merely comfortable. She had built what they could not comprehend, because she had listened to a silence they had never bothered to hear, the deep, steady silence of the earth itself. Before we begin, let us know where you are watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The story of Elsbeth's impossible cabin began, as such stories often do, with a death. It had happened the previous winter, in a cabin that was the very model of frontier competence, built by her father, Gunther Schmidt, a man who knew timber and tools better than any man in the valley. It was a handsome cabin of saddle-notched logs with a fieldstone fireplace tall enough for a man to stand in. It was also a thermal catastrophe, a machine perfectly designed to suck warmth out and radiate cold in. Gunther, a mining engineer from the Harz Mountains of Germany, knew this. He would stand before the roaring fire, his front scorching while his back froze, and mutter in his native tongue about the inefficiency, the sheer waste of it all. "We feed the beast," he'd say to Elsbeth, pointing a calloused finger at the fireplace, "and it gives us a flicker of warmth while stealing the rest for the sky. It is a fool's bargain." He had plans, of course. His journals were filled with them. Sketches of massive serpentine stoves, notes on the stable temperature of the deep earth, calculations on thermal mass and heat retention. But a homesteader's first duty was to clear land, plant a crop, and build a shelter that looked like everyone else's shelter. Innovation was a luxury for a future that, for Gunther Schmidt, would never arrive. That January had been relentless. A cold snap settled over the territory and refused to budge. For 3 weeks, the temperature never rose above zero. The snow was piled 5 feet deep on the level, and the wind was a constant, abrasive force that scoured the land. The great stone fireplace in their cabin became a ravenous god, demanding a constant sacrifice of wood. The woodpile, which had seemed immense in October, dwindled with terrifying speed. The heat it produced was fleeting, a temporary victory in a war of attrition against the cold. The moment the fire died down, the cabin's temperature would plummet. The log walls, each timber a conduit for the cold, would begin to radiate a chill that settled deep in the bones. The single-pane windows were opaque with a thick, fern-like layer of interior frost. They spent their days huddled in a small circle of warmth, wrapped in every blanket and quilt they owned. The end came when the wood ran out. Gunther, already weakened by the cold and a persistent cough, had no choice. He pulled on his heavy coat, his movements slow and weary, and went out into the 30-below air to fell another tree. The sound of his axe was a brittle, lonely percussion in the frozen silence. He worked for hours, his breath pluming and freezing on his beard. When he finally came back inside, dragging a few precious logs, he was shivering uncontrollably. The cough had settled deep in his chest. That night, pneumonia took hold. Elsbeth sat by his side, feeding the fire, piling blankets on his shaking form. He was burning with fever, but shivering from a cold that came from within. The fire roared, the logs crackled, and yet the man who had cut them was freezing to death just 6 feet away. In a moment of lucidity, he gripped his daughter's hand. His voice was a dry rasp. "Nicht gegen den Berg," he whispered, his eyes looking past her toward the snow-dusted mountain that loomed over their claim. "Mit dem Berg." Not against the mountain, with the mountain. He died just before dawn, his last breath a small white cloud in the frigid air of the cabin. The fire he had spent his last strength to feed offered no comfort. It was just a bright, useless spectacle in a room full of mortal cold. When the spring thaw finally came, and the circuit rider could make his way through the valley, the community gathered at the Schmidt homestead. They were good people, conditioned by a harsh land to be practical. Their sympathy was genuine, but their solutions were stark. Mr. Silas Croft, the unofficial leader of the settlement, a man whose square jaw and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of conventional wisdom, laid a hand on Elsbeth's shoulder. He was a carpenter by trade, a man who believed there was one right way to build a cabin, one right way to live, and no other. "Elsbeth, your father was a good man," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But this is no place for a child to be alone. The Gables are heading to Fort Benton in a fortnight. You'll go with them. They'll find a decent family for you there." Mrs. Gable nodded, her face etched with concern. "A little girl can't manage a claim. You need a woman's care, a roof over your head that isn't yours to worry about." They spoke of her as if she were a parcel to be delivered, a problem to be solved. They saw a small, slight girl of 12, orphaned and alone. They did not see the mind behind her quiet gray eyes, a mind that had absorbed years of her father's talk of geology, thermodynamics, and engineering. Elsbeth stood still, her worn leather boots planted firmly on the damp earth of her father's claim. She looked from Mr. Croft's earnest face to Mrs. Gable's worried one. Then she looked past them to the granite stubbled shoulder of the mountain that rose up behind the cabin. Her father's last words echoed in her mind. Mit dem Berg. "I am staying," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and absolute, with no hint of doubt. A silence fell over the small group. Mr. Croft's expression shifted from paternal concern to stern disbelief. "Don't be foolish, child. You can't survive a winter here alone. The mountain will take you, just as it took your father." His words were meant to be a final, sobering truth, but to Elsbeth they were a fundamental misreading of the world. The mountain had not taken her father. The cabin had. The foolish, drafty box that fought the cold and always lost. "You're wrong," she said, her gaze still fixed on the mountain. The cabin failed, not the mountain. Croft let out a short, frustrated sigh. He exchanged a look with the others, a look that said, "Grief has touched her mind." "She'll learn," he muttered to the man beside him. "Winter teaches harsh lessons." They left her there, standing beside the grave of her father, convinced she was a tragedy waiting to happen. But as she watched them walk away, Elsbeth felt not fear, but a cold, hard clarity. Grief had not broken her mind. It had focused it. She would not fight the mountain. She would ask it for shelter. For the remainder of the spring, Elsbeth did not touch a single log for building. She did not clear more land. Instead, she embarked on a period of intense, methodical research. Her father's journals became her scripture. They were not diaries of feelings, but logs of observation and theory. Page after page was filled with his precise, angular script, detailing the properties of different types of stone, the thermal conductivity of soil, the principles of air convection. There were intricate cross-section drawings of Kachelofen, the massive ceramic-tiled masonry stoves of his homeland. He had sketched their complex internal baffles, the long winding smoke paths designed to extract every last calorie of heat from the wood before the smoke was allowed to escape. He had written copious notes in the margins. The heat must be stored in mass. The fire is temporary. The mass is constant. A brief, hot fire, then hours of radiant peace. Elsbeth read these pages not once, but dozens of times, until the diagrams were burned into her memory. She traced the path of the smoke with her finger, understanding that the goal was not to vent the fire, but to hold its energy captive. Her practical research took place outdoors. She spent days observing, not as a child might, but as an engineer conducting a field survey. She watched the way the sun tracked across the sky, noting which slopes received the most direct light during the short winter days. She studied the dens of the local wildlife. She found a fox den dug into a south-facing clay bank, its entrance sheltered from the prevailing north wind. She lay nearby for hours watching the kits play at the entrance, warm and safe. She found a badger's set, a complex burrow dug deep into a hillside, and noted how the earth itself formed the walls and ceiling of its home. These creatures did not build flimsy shelters on exposed ground. They integrated their homes into the landscape, borrowing the immense thermal stability of the earth. They worked with the mountain. Her father's tools, which had seemed impossibly heavy before, now felt like extensions of her own will. She took his survey transit and plumb bob and began to map the terrain at the base of the mountain. She was looking for a specific combination of features, a checklist derived from her father's notes. It had to be south-facing, to catch the winter sun. The ground had to be stable, with good drainage, to prevent dampness, and most importantly, it needed a solid rock face, a wall of granite that could serve as the literal backbone of her structure. After a week of searching, she found it, a gently sloped area at the foot of the mountain that ended in a sheer 20-foot wall of gray granite. The stone was solid, ancient, and baked in the afternoon sun. Below it, the soil was a mix of clay and gravel, ideal for drainage and for making the mortar she would need. This was the place. This would be her stand against the winter. Preparation was a slow, grueling process. She needed stone, clay, and timber. Using her father's quarry tools, a heavy sledgehammer, wedges, and a pry bar, she began to split and shape flat stones from a nearby outcropping for the foundation and the stove. It was brutal work for a 12-year-old. Each strike of the hammer sent a shock up her arms. Her hands, soft from a winter spent indoors, were quickly blistered, then calloused. She learned to read the grain of the rock, to find the lines of weakness, to use the wedges to let the stone do the work. She moved the slabs one by one on a small wooden sledge, her muscles screaming in protest. Kaiser would watch her, a low whine in his throat, as if questioning the sanity of this tiny human's war against geology. Next was the clay. She found a rich deposit by the creek, dug it out with a spade, and hauled it bucket by bucket to the building site. She mixed it with sand and water, testing the consistency, adding straw as a binder, kneading it with her bare feet, just as her father's journal had described. The men of the valley passing on the track below would sometimes stop and watch her. They saw a girl making mud pies, a child lost in a world of make-believe. They did not see an engineer preparing the critical ingredient for a high-efficiency heating system. They would shake their heads and ride on, whispering about the poor, grief-stricken Schmidt girl. It was when she began to dig that Silas Croft finally intervened. He had ridden over on the pretext of checking on her, but his true purpose was to put a stop to what he saw as dangerous foolishness. He found her at the base of the granite wall covered in dirt, methodically excavating a large pit into the hillside. The hole was already 4 feet deep and about 20 feet wide. "Elsbeth, in God's name, what are you doing?" he demanded, dismounting from his horse. His voice boomed with authority. Elsbeth paused, leaning on her shovel. She was not intimidated. She had spent too many weeks communing with rock and earth to be cowed by a man's loud voice. "I'm building my house," she said simply. Croft gestured impatiently at the hole. "This isn't a house, it's a pit. You can't build a cabin in a hole. The damp will rot the logs in a single season. You'll be living in a mud puddle." She looked him in the eye, her expression unreadable. "The back wall will be the mountain," she said, pointing with her chin at the granite face. "The side walls will be buried in the earth I'm digging out. The earth will keep it warm." She then pointed to the piles of stone and the pits of clay. "And the stove will be made of stone to hold the heat. One small fire will keep it warm all day and all night." Croft stared at her, his mind unable to process what he was hearing. It went against every principle of construction he held dear. A cabin needed to be raised off the ground, to have air circulating beneath it to keep it dry. A fireplace needed a wide throat to draw well. Burying walls was madness. It was what you did for a root cellar, not a home. He let out a short, harsh laugh. It was not a sound of amusement, but of utter disbelief. "A girl digging her own burrow like a ground squirrel," he said, shaking his head. Gunther was a smart man, but it seems his ideas have addled your mind. You'll bury yourself alive in that hole, or you'll freeze in a damp, dark cave. That's not how you build a cabin, child. This is not work for a girl." He fully expected her to cry, to give up, to finally accept his offer of a ride to Fort Benton. Instead, she just picked up her shovel and drove it into the earth with a solid thud. "This is how my father's books say to build," she replied, not looking at him, "and this is how I will build." Defeated by her impossible stubbornness, Croft mounted his horse and rode away. The story spread through the valley like wildfire, embellished with each telling. The orphan girl wasn't just staying. She was digging her own grave. She was building a mud hut, a cave, a tomb. The laughter was not always cruel. Sometimes it was tinged with pity, but it was constant. She was the valley's cautionary tale, its resident fool. Elsbeth heard the whispers when she went to the small trading post for supplies. She saw the looks, but the mockery of men was a faint and distant noise compared to the clear, solid logic of her father's journals and the unyielding truth of the mountain. The construction phase consumed her summer and autumn. It was a race against the coming cold, a solitary testament to human will. The first and most arduous task after the excavation was laying the foundation. She dug a trench a foot wide and 3 feet deep below the frost line, and filled it with large rocks, creating a stable base that would not heave when the ground froze. On top of this, she laid the flattest stones she had quarried, mortaring them together with her clay mixture. This was the footprint of her home. Next came the floor, a critical element to defeat the damp that Mr. Croft had warned of. She built a subfloor of heavy logs, raised a foot off the gravel bed she had laid down. She filled the space between the logs with a thick layer of dry moss and sealed it with tightly fitted pine planks. It was an insulated platform, a raft of warmth floating above the cold earth. Then came the most peculiar part of her design, a feature that earned her more ridicule than any other. From the spot where the stove would stand, she began digging a long, narrow trench heading straight out away from the cabin for 50 feet. It was back-breaking work, 3 feet deep through rocky soil. Men riding by would shout down, asking if she was digging for gold. She ignored them. Into this trench, she carefully laid sections of vitrified clay pipe her father had purchased for a well he never built. Each section was 2 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. She sealed the joints meticulously with a thick clay slurry, ensuring it was airtight. At the far end, 50 feet from the house, she built a small, stone-lined intake shaft that rose just above the ground, covered with a grate to keep animals out. She then carefully buried the entire length of pipe, tamping the earth down firmly. This was her Erdwärmetauscher, an earth-air heat exchanger. The principle, as her father's notes explained, was simple and elegant. The earth, 6 feet below the surface, maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Air drawn through this long buried pipe in the winter would be naturally pre-warmed by the earth before it even entered the cabin, providing a constant supply of fresh, tempered air for the stove and eliminating the icy drafts that plagued conventional cabins. It was a stroke of unseen genius, buried and forgotten by the mockers above. The timber walls rose slowly. She used her father's block and tackle, a system of ropes and pulleys, to hoist the heavy hand-hewn logs into place. It was a slow, painstaking process of leverage and patience. She was not strong, but she was clever, using physics to do what muscle could not. She built only 3 walls, the long south-facing front wall and the 2 shorter east and west walls that stepped back into the excavated hillside. The north wall was the mountain itself, a sheer, solid face of granite that would act as a colossal thermal battery, absorbing the stove's heat and radiating it back into the room for hours. The heart of the home, the Cachalofen, was her masterpiece. She built it with the reverence of a priestess building an altar. The foundation was a deep bed of sand and stone. The core was fire brick her father had hauled from Bozeman. Around this, she constructed the massive outer shell of stone and her own clay mortar. It was not a simple box. Inside, hidden from view, was a labyrinth. She carefully constructed a series of baffles and channels that forced the smoke and hot gases from the firebox to travel a long, convoluted path up, down, and sideways through the stove's interior mass before finally exiting through a small flue at the top. This serpentine path was designed to strip the heat from the exhaust gases, transferring it into the stone and clay. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it was cool enough that she could almost hold her hand in it. The efficiency was staggering. Over 80% of the wood's energy would be captured by the stove's mass, compared to the 10% of a conventional fireplace. It took her 3 weeks to build, layer by agonizing layer, smoothing the clay plaster with her hands until it was a seamless, sculptural form. Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive trapper who lived up the creek, was the only one who showed any genuine curiosity. He stopped by one afternoon, chewing on a piece of willow bark, and squinted at the monstrous stone structure. "Seems a powerful small firebox for such a big pile of rock," he observed, "and the chimney hole's no bigger than my fist. How's it draw?" Elsbeth, wiping clay from her brow, explained it as simply as she could. "It's not meant to draw fast. It's meant to burn slow and hot, and to make the smoke stay inside for a long time, to give its heat to the stone." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Like a snake digesting a rabbit. Whole thing gets warm." It was the most intelligent thing anyone had said about her project all summer. With the walls and stove complete, she began the final stages. She built the roof with heavy timber rafters, laid thick planks across them, and then covered the entire structure with a layer of thick tar paper her father had saved. On top of this, she carefully replaced the sod she had excavated, creating a living roof that would be covered in snow in the winter, adding yet another layer of perfect insulation. Then, she and Kaiser spent a week moving the tons of excavated earth, piling it against the east and west walls, creating thick, sloping berms that blended the cabin into the hillside. From the sides, her home was nearly invisible, just a gentle rise in the land. Only the south-facing front was exposed to the elements, with its single, small window and a heavy, insulated door she built from 2 layers of thick planks with a wool blanket sandwiched between them. By the first snowfall in late October, she was done. Her home was not a cabin sitting on the land, but a shelter embraced by it. It was a fusion of timber, stone, and earth, a testament to an idea her neighbors could not grasp. The first tests were subtle, private victories. As the nights grew colder, the valley's cabins began to puff smoke from dawn till dusk. Elsbeth would light a small hot fire in her Cachalofen for just 2 hours in the morning. The stove would consume a surprisingly small amount of wood, burning it down to a fine white ash. Then she would close the flue and the firebox damper, sealing the heat inside the stove's massive body. Hours later, the surface of the stove was still radiating a gentle, steady warmth. The entire structure had become a giant slow-release radiator. She began keeping a log, just as her father would have. She used his old thermometer, hanging it in the center of the room. Outside temperature, 25 degrees. Inside, 12 hours after the fire was out, 66 degrees. The air coming from the floor register connected to her underground pipe was a steady 52 degrees, a full 27 degrees warmer than the outside air it was drawn from. There were no drafts. The granite back wall, cool to the touch in the morning, would be warm by evening, having soaked up the day's heat from the stove. She had a small, well-stocked woodshed just outside her door, but she was using less than a quarter of the wood her father had burned to achieve a far greater level of comfort. She and Kaiser would sit in the quiet warmth, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind over the sod roof, and she would feel a deep sense of rightness. The system worked. The mountain was keeping its promise. January arrived with a vengeance. For weeks, the weather had been harsh, but manageable. Then the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow-gray, and the air grew unnaturally still. Old Man Hemlock, passing by on his snowshoes, paused and looked at the sky. "Got the feel of a real killer," he said to Elsbeth, his breath freezing in a cloud. "Don't you be going nowhere, girl. This one's going to try and wipe the slate clean." He was right. That afternoon, the wind began to rise from the north, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. The snow began not as flakes, but as a horizontal torrent of fine, sharp ice crystals. The great blizzard of 1878 had begun. For 3 days, the world outside Elsbeth's window ceased to exist. It was replaced by a churning, opaque wall of white. The wind was a physical force, a constant, violent pressure that rattled the door and scoured the exposed front wall of the cabin. The temperature plummeted. It dropped to 20 below, then 30, then an almost unimaginable 40 below zero. With the wind chill, it was a cold that could freeze exposed flesh in less than a minute. Inside Elsbeth's shelter, there was peace. The howling of the wind was a muted, distant roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. The sod roof, now buried under 6 feet of insulating snow, deadened all sound. Her routine was simple. Each morning, she would load the Kachelofen with a few logs, get a hot, fast fire going, and then close it up. For the rest of the day and night, the massive stove and the granite back wall radiated their stored heat, keeping the small space at a steady, comfortable 68 degrees. The air from the underground pipe flowed in fresh and pre-warmed, preventing the stuffiness that could plague a sealed winter cabin. She had food, water from melted snow, and light from her candles. She spent her time mending her clothes, reading her father's books, and talking quietly to Kaiser, who was utterly untroubled by the storm, dozing contentedly on the warm floorboards. She was not just surviving. She was living. It was a different story at the Croft homestead. Their cabin, considered the best built in the valley, had become a torture chamber. Silas Croft and his family were engaged in a desperate, losing battle. The huge stone fireplace, the pride of his craftsmanship, was their enemy. It roared day and night, consuming their dwindling woodpile at a ferocious rate. The draft it required to burn sucked frigid air in through every crack and crevice in the log walls. The result was a house of extreme contrasts. A few feet from the fire, their skin would scorch. 10 feet away, water would freeze in a bucket. The walls radiated an intense, penetrating cold. The windows were blind with a thick armor of ice. They had hung blankets over them, but the cold seeped through. They were all huddled together, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and fear. They had started burning fence posts. Soon they would have to start on the furniture. Silas's wife, Mary, had developed a racking cough, and his youngest son was listless, his skin pale and cool to the touch. The cold was winning. Silas, a man who had never known failure, was filled with a growing, terrifying dread. He looked at the roaring, useless fire, and for the first time he remembered the words of the little orphan girl he had mocked. The cabin failed, not the mountain. On the morning of the 4th day, their last log turned to ash. The fire died, and the cold, which had been held at bay, flooded the cabin in a tidal wave. The temperature inside plummeted to freezing, then below. Mary's breathing became shallow. Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they would not survive another night. There was only one hope, a hope so absurd, so humiliating, that he had refused to consider it until now. The girl's burrow, the mud hole he had to try. Bundling himself in his heaviest coats, he plunged out into the blizzard. The force of the wind knocked him to his knees. The cold was a stunning physical blow that took his breath away. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. The 100-yard distance to Elspeth's shelter was a polar expedition. He navigated by instinct, by a faint memory of the slope of the land. Snow filled his eyes and mouth. His beard froze solid in seconds. He fell, crawled, and rose again, driven by the image of his family freezing to death. He was weeping, the tears freezing instantly to his cheeks. He was no longer a proud carpenter, the leader of the valley. He was just a desperate man, crawling through a frozen hell toward a child's folly. When he finally stumbled against her door, he was near the end of his strength. He beat on it with a frozen fist, his shouts swallowed by the wind. The door opened, and a rectangle of soft, warm light spilled out onto the snow. Elspeth stood there, holding a candle, Kaiser at her side. She looked at the snow-caked monster before her, his face a mask of ice and desperation, and showed no surprise. The wave of warmth that flowed out of the cabin was the most shocking thing Silas Croft had ever experienced. It wasn't the dry, scorching heat of a fireplace. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth, as if the air itself were alive and breathing. He stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor, gasping. For a moment, he was utterly disoriented. There was no roaring fire. The room was quiet. The great stone stove was merely warm to the touch, like a sun-baked rock in summer. He looked at the frost-freeze window, the sleeping dog, the calm, quiet girl. He saw the thermometer on the wall, 68 degrees. He began to sob, great, racking sobs of despair, relief, and profound, shattering humiliation. "My family," he choked out. "Mary, the boy, we're freezing. The fire's gone." Elspeth looked at him, her gray eyes holding no triumph, no "I told you so." They held only a calm, practical compassion. She nodded once. "Bring them here," she said. It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. She handed him a thermos of warm broth her father had owned. "Drink this first, then I will help you." Together they fought their way back to the Croft cabin. It was like entering a tomb. The air was frigid, and the silence was terrifying. They bundled up Mary and the children and, in a slow, agonizing procession, half carried them through the storm to the impossible warmth of Elsbeth's shelter. As Silas settled his family into the life-saving heat, he looked around the small, simple room. He saw the insulated floor, the massive, silent stove, the faint wisp of air coming from the floor register. He saw the solid granite wall at the back, warm to the touch, and he finally understood. This was not a burrow. It was a machine. A brilliant, elegant machine for living, designed by an engineer and built by his daughter. It did not fight the winter. It tamed it. It did not consume fuel in a panic. It sipped it with calculated efficiency. It worked with the mountain, with the earth, with the very laws of nature he had never bothered to understand. He, Silas Croft, the master carpenter, had built a wooden tent. This 12-year-old girl, this child he had pitied and mocked, had built a fortress. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the sun rose on a transformed world. The valley was buried under 10 feet of snow, a landscape of profound silence and death. The news, when it finally passed between the surviving homesteads, was grim. The Miller family, 2 miles downriver, had been found frozen in their cabin. Old Man Hemlock had survived, but barely. Every family had a story of desperate struggle, of frostbite, of near starvation. And then there was the other story, the one that spread from homesteader to homesteader with a sense of awe and disbelief. Silas Croft and his family were alive because they had taken refuge in the orphan girl's hillside cabin. Slowly, as the valley dug itself out, they came to see. They came in ones and twos, their faces grim and humbled. They stood in the doorway of Elsbeth's small home, blinking in the gentle warmth, and they fell silent. They touched the warm stone of the cachaloaf, and they felt the fresh, tempered air flowing from the register. They ran their hands over the solid granite of the back wall. They were not looking at a child's strange project anymore. They were looking at the future. They were looking at salvation. Silas Croft, his pride burned away by the blizzard, became her most devoted student. He asked her questions, his voice filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. "How did you know?" he would ask. "How did you understand this?" Elsbeth did not lecture, she did not boast. She simply brought out her father's journals. She opened them on the small wooden table, and with Croft and the other men crowded around, she pointed to the diagrams, to the calculations, to the elegant German script. "My father knew," she said. "The heat must be stored in the mass. The earth is warmer than the air. The smoke must give up its heat before it leaves." She translated her father's principles into simple, practical terms. She was no longer the foolish orphan girl. She was the keeper of a sacred knowledge, a knowledge that meant the difference between life and death. The child had become the teacher, and the strong, proud men of the valley became her pupils. The following summer, a revolution in architecture took place in the valley. No new cabins were built on the open flats. Instead, men were digging. They were excavating into hillsides, seeking the embrace of the earth. Silas Croft, using his carpentry skills guided by Elsbeth's new knowledge, helped his neighbors build their own integrated shelters. They learned to quarry stone not just for fireplaces, but for the massive, heat-hoarding stoves they now called Schmidt stoves. They learned to bury their air intakes, to build sod roofs, to see a granite cliff not as an obstacle, but as a gift. The laughter that had once echoed through the valley was replaced by the sounds of construction, of a community rebuilding itself on a foundation of humility and wisdom. They had learned the harshest lesson the frontier could teach, that conventional wisdom is only wise until it gets you killed. Innovation, born of tragedy and carried forward by the quiet determination of a child, was the only thing that could truly conquer the cold. Years passed. The valley thrived. The homes, nestled into the landscape, were warm and secure. The brutal winters still came, but they were no longer a terror. They were simply a season to be weathered in comfort and safety. Elsbeth Schmidt never left her small cabin. She grew into a woman, as quiet and steady as the mountain that formed her back wall. She never married, but she was never alone. She was the heart of the community, the woman they came to for advice on building, on healing, on living in harmony with the land. Her father's legacy was not a name on a gravestone, but the quiet warmth in every home in the valley. His principles had outlasted him, carried forward by the daughter they had all dismissed. On a cool autumn evening, Elsbeth would sometimes stand outside her door, Kaiser's descendant resting a graying muzzle on her hand. She would look out at the valley, at the soft plumes of smoke rising from the chimneys of the Schmidt stoves, and feel a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had not just built a house. She had built a future. She had listened to the mountain, and in its stony silence she had found the secret to survival.